It's very interesting what's been happening with the Kavanaugh investigation. Families have been divided in their opinions about whether to believe Dr. Ford or not. To set things out to begin with, my opinion is that something happened to her, but I don't think Kavanaugh was involved. That's my opinion. Other people have different opinions. And this chap here has a specific sort of opinion which I found both interesting and intensely disturbing. It's an opinion piece in The Guardian, where else? So, okay, it doesn't have to be straight news, obviously. And this chap, Richard Wolffe, is the author of a book which is basically a panegyric to Barack Obama. So you can imagine that his views would be heavily influenced by his opinion of the previous president. However, there's something else going here which speaks to me of a sort of pathology. His opinions go beyond a simple political disagreement. They are evidence of an intense physical revulsion, which isn't something that should be happening in politics. So, Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation isn't democracy, it's a judicial coup. He's talking about the fact that the Republicans managed to get an advantage, at least ostensibly. But that's not really what he's talking about. This is what he thinks is the synopsis of his argument, but it isn't. Mitch McConnell and his ilk must be delighted. They've waged a decades-long campaign to stack the courts with conservative ideologues. Actually, the Republicans have tried to make the Supreme Court into a body that respects the Constitution. You can say that the Constitution needs changing if you want, but as it stands now, they try to work within the Constitution and interpret it. The sort of judges that Mr. Wolffe is talking about are the sort of judges who are prepared to ditch bits of the Constitution. You can have an argument about that, of course, but that's not the point of this article, whatever Wolffe thinks. Brett Kavanaugh is the symptom, not the cause of our sickness. He regards the political process as a sickness, and words to do with sickness occur liberally throughout this article. And then there's this. He is the nasal congestion snorted out by the politics that have plagued us for the best part of 3 decades. This is a repellent metaphor, and it tells us a lot more about Mr. Wolffe than it does about the Democratic Party or Trump. He is talking about democratic politics as a contagion. He's using language associated with infected matter, something you should not only merely avoid but cover over with Lysol or whatever. As I said, this goes beyond ordinary political disagreement. If we're ever going to recover our health and sanity, we need to start with the correct diagnosis. Well, I'm going to interrupt my psychological analysis here by saying, Mr. Wolffe, that I can save you some time. The sickness showed up when Bernie Sanders was edged out by the Clinton steamroller. That was the sickness. The fact that everybody in the Democratic Party and in the public world knew that there had been a lot of fixing going on, and it was quite obvious and open to the world, and the people in power in the Democratic Party thought that they could get away with it. That's the sickness. However, I digress. For all the justified outrage about sexual assault involving allegations that Kavanaugh denied, you notice that. It wasn't just Kavanaugh who denied it, it was an entire bank of witnesses as well. But he managed to imply that Kavanaugh denied them, although he was guilty, at a time when women were supposed to be responsible for men's baser instincts. This was the second half of the 20th century. That would not have been considered sexual assault. There was no rape. If you're going to look at it in the terms of those times, it was a terrible scare for a girl of such tender years, but it was not sexual assault. Well, it wouldn't have been. It is now, of course. But they were both kids, and they would have had a talking to if it had come out. The girl's mother would have told her to be more careful in future, and the boy would have been tapped on the wrist and told boys would be boys. That's basically what would have happened. But that's not really where Wolffe is going. The new Supreme Court Justice represents an even bigger lie than his mindless fabrications about ralphing and boofing. He can blame his weak stomach if he likes. The rest of us are heaving at the sight of a general long confidence trick succouring an entire democracy. He's supposed to be talking about some sort of a colossal political cheat that's going on, but he uses the word heaving. Sickness again. Sickness. Nasal congestion. Okay? So this may come as a surprise. Oh, judges make decisions based on law, not on policy, not on political pressure, not on the identity of the parties, said Deb Fisher, the Nebraska Republican who quoted liberally from Kavanaugh. This may come as a surprise to anyone who has been awake and conscious for the last several decades of a campaign to stack the courts with conservative ideologues. Are you trying to tell me, Wolffe, that the Democratic Party hasn't been trying to do the same thing? If the Republicans are better at it than the Democrats and more successful, then perhaps you should wonder why. So he talks about how Mitch McConnell thinks that it's a good idea to have conservative judges in the Supreme Court. Putting strict constructionists, relatively young, on the courts for lifetime appointments is the best way to have a long-term positive impact on America. You see, it's a difference in philosophy. The Democrats think they can tinker about with the walls of the Constitution, the boundaries of it, whereas most Republicans are more attached to the idea that you have a Constitution and you have to work within its boundaries. You can fiddle about with things a bit inside, but you have to stay within the limits, like a sort of football game. You can kick the ball about as much as you want, but you shouldn't go over the boundary. I'm talking about British football, by the way. Well, the football that exists everywhere else in the world, but in America, where what you play is what we would call a sort of rugby with helmets. Okay, he doesn't like the idea of strict constructionists. Now, them's fancy words for conservative ideologues who get jobs as judges. And let's have a look at that sentence. Them's fancy words. Oh yes, Wolffe, right down with the homies, aren't you? Now, as a matter of fact, that reminds me of an American TV program of many, many, many years ago called Amos and Andy. I've seen some clips of it. It was apparently taken off the air because it was considered racist. The two protagonists were black and apparently they got into all sorts of scrapes. I don't know what happened, but the language they used was this sort of language. And I believe that was considered not very respectful towards the African Americans. Mr. Wolffe, surely you're not a racist, are you? Anyway, them's fancy words for conservative, for conservative ideologues who get jobs as judges. No, they are judges. They're not ideologues, they're judges. And they're judges that got put in place under a democratic process in accordance with the Constitution, that you obviously don't think too much of. They emerged in opposition to the clearly crazy Supreme Court that voted unanimously against segregation in Brown versus Board of Education. That was in 1954 when they decided to desegregate the schools. This is interesting because the schools were segregated under a democratic administration. Wilson was responsible for that. So I don't really see what point Wolffe is trying to make there. There's no meaningful definition of this jurisprudence, but there is a political understanding that it is opposed to activist judges who are entirely and astonishingly all liberals. So, yeah, there's this discussion about activist judges. That is, people who think you can mess around with the boundaries of the Constitution. Look, if you mess around with the boundaries, it is no longer the American Constitution. You're not in America anymore. Now, you may decide that's where you want to be, but you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. In the words of George W. Bush, when asked what kind of Supreme Court justices he'd nominate, Bush said simply, "I don't believe in liberal activist judges. I believe in strict constructionists." Now, what he's saying is we have to be respectful of and preserve the boundaries set by the Constitution. This is as inconvenient for a Republican president as for a Democrat. I would have you remember, Wolffe, there have been many presidents considerably irked by the boundaries of the Constitution. Now, here you are, something of a sick joke here when Conservative activists decided to end the recount of votes cast for Bush and Gore just 2 months later, handing Bush the presidency. Well, I don't know a lot about that, but I do know that there was an incident with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. So why don't we just call that one a draw, Wolffe? Now let's go further down. He's very annoyed. It was the Democrats who were playing politics with the... Oh, yeah, sorry. He's being heavily ironic here, I think. Although, you know that one about many a true word spoken in jest? It was the Democrats who were playing politics with the Supreme Court, trying to delay the Kavanaugh nomination until the elections. It wasn't the Republicans who delayed President Barack Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland for the best part of a year until the 2016 election. I like the way he gives him the full name here, President Barack Obama, not President Obama. He had to roll around his hero's complete name and title. And I'm quite sure that the Republicans were playing politics. It's not as if the Democrats don't do it either. Let's skip over this and let's quote Kavanaugh. "This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit," he raged, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump. What do you mean? He is being very fair there because it's not apparent pent-up anger, is it? And the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record. He is a conservative. I have seen a couple of his rulings with which I heartily disagree, but they're not evil. They are simply to do with the Constitution. Revenge on behalf of the Clintons and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. Well, I don't know about the outside left-wing opposition groups, but I do know that the Democrats are obsessed with revenge on behalf of the Clintons, so I reckon that in the main, Kavanaugh's probably right. In this world where victims are aggressors and attackers are victims, it's hard to know which way is up. Well, I think you are finding it difficult to work out which way is up because, as far as you're concerned, emotions trump the law. And I'm not of that opinion. But when you do have emotions trumping the law, you cannot know which way is up because emotions swing violently from side to side and there is no reference point anymore. Not least because the whole political world is heading down the sewer. It's my belief that the Democrats led America in that direction. But beside that, it's interesting you're using the word sewer. Here we are with effluent again. Lindsey Graham said, "I hope the American people can see through this sham." And he takes that word and throws it back at him. A sham it certainly was. The FBI background check into Kavanaugh was so heavily curtailed by the Trump White House. You notice the Trump White House, not President Donald Trump, just Trump and White House, not the administration. He can't bring himself to call it a democratic administration. That it served as a cover-up, a fig leaf to protect vulnerable senators from embarrassment. I'm going to get to the vulnerable senators in a minute, but I just want you to look at this. It served as a cover-up, a fig leaf. Now, having worked in media myself, I can tell you, you don't use 6 words where 3 will do. And a cover-up is a fig leaf. You don't need both of them. And I've noticed this with Owen Jones as well. He does this, using 2 sets of the same expression. And when I see that, I've got the idea that the writer is trying to convince himself rather than his audience. That's an aside. One of those was the main Republican, Susan Collins, a self-styled moderate. You notice how he says self-styled there? Hasn't anyone else called her a moderate? Who pretzeled herself trying to make sense of her own vote. The pretzeled is good, at least that's not bodily effluent anymore, maybe because she calls herself a moderate. He's being a bit kinder to her. And she said that the judge was endorsed by the American Bar Association, preferring to ignore the fact that the ABA said it was re-evaluating the whole endorsement because Kavanaugh had acted so plain bonkers in the hearing last week. I wonder how you would act if your entire life had been called into question in a public forum over something that you were accused of doing when you were a teenager and that there's a very good chance didn't happen anyway. And Collins, like so many other seemingly sympathetic Republicans, said she believed Dr. Ford's testimony. She just didn't actually believe her. "I believe that she's a survivor of a sexual assault and that this trauma has upended her life," Collins said earnestly. Nevertheless, the 4 witnesses she named could not corroborate any of the events of that gathering where she says the assault occurred. And that's the whole point. You can make accusations, but if you call witnesses and they say they can't corroborate anything, then the case is closed. It has to be. You can't just go on the tears of somebody who says she remembers it, despite everybody else not remembering it. I think she's remembering something else. That's my opinion. And then he says this. This makes about as much sense as all those medieval trials of French pigs. This has absolutely no relevance to any of this. It's just like a sort of screeching halt and then a wheelie turn into a completely different direction. And I think this is where Wolffe himself realises he's not making any sort of a logical argument, because after this he starts making one mistake after the other. Of course, the curious case of Brett Kavanaugh is the perfect emblem for the politics of Trump. Again, not President Donald Trump, not even President Trump, but the politics of Trump. And here we have this word emblem. Now, an emblem is a thing. You put an emblem on something, or you talk about a thing being an emblem. But a case, the Brett Kavanaugh case, is not a thing. It might be an illustration, but it's not an emblem. And this guy has very good control of his language and an excellent vocabulary. He knows that, but he's losing it here. And he's just slamming down words now. There's more. And here it is. Old white men. The instant shut up from somebody who has no other argument. Old white men is the last resort. With a predilection for sexual harassment, assault and infidelity. Well, let's get this straight. First of all, what Kavanaugh's accused of happened when he was a young white boy, but he probably wasn't there anyway. And he certainly demonstrated throughout his subsequent career no predilection whatsoever for sexual harassment, assault and infidelity. Maybe, Wolffe, you were talking about Clinton by mistake. And here we have another. It has been literally awesome to hear about the presumption of innocence. Just, if he'd have started with this, I wouldn't have read the rest of his article. Literally. It means it really is this. And then you've got awesome. Awesome means, well, what does it mean? It means spiritually overwhelming, doesn't it? Awesome. You see a wonderful landscape or a huge display of something, or you have a religious experience. That's awesome. It isn't literally awesome to see something that you don't like. To hear about the presumption of innocence from the party that still chants "lock her up" at presidential rallies. Well, you may not like that, but the fact is that Clinton actually has been found breaking the law, provably and with witnesses, which none of the above apply to the Kavanaugh case. Okay, so he ends with, "You're the best team player the Conservative movement could wish for, and that's exactly why they fought so hard to get you on the court for the rest of your living days." There's something quite nasty about that, the rest of your living, and not the rest of your life, the rest of your living days. I don't know why, but it seems like the sort of language you use for somebody under sentence of death or something along those lines. But what I particularly want to draw to your attention is the constant references to sickness and effluent. Oh, I've forgotten, somewhere in here he uses the word lickspittle. Hang on a minute, here we are. "Boy, you all want power. I hope you never get it," yelled Lindsey Graham, the lickspittle Republican senator. Again, more body effluent. And if you have read, and I strongly advise you to do this, a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And the whole book is a discussion about the difference between a simple dislike of something and a visceral, physical revulsion. And a lot of this stems from people's ideas about ritual purity. So, for instance, there's that thing about Brahmins in India feeling polluted if a Dalit, the lower caste, if the shadow of a Dalit falls on them. That's an extreme example of feelings of ritual impurity. And it looks to me like this guy is of the opinion that the Trump administration, that the Republicans, that anything surrounding them are ritually impure. These constant references to illness and things you don't want to touch. There's an actual loathing in the way that you would loathe contact with feces or vomit. I mean, you can see that in his general language. And this is what I find very disturbing, because he's not alone in this opinion. And this sort of idea of contamination is actually what gets people killed, because you don't argue with contaminants, You get rid of them. Unfortunately, I don't think that Wolffe is in a position to do that. But what worries me is the company he keeps, because there are people with whom he does associate who probably do have the same attitude, and they are in a position of some sort of political power. I'm very grateful for financial contributions. But if you don't want to give money, you can still help a lot by sharing this and other videos I've made. Also, remember to check your subscription from time to time, as sometimes subscriptions get erased for one reason or another. Till next time.